I am very honored to introduce Geoff as our keynote speaker. And Geoff is obviously an incredible person and who is going to talk to us about the topic of internet centralization. And is this good or is it bad? I would say that I would throw my own questions here, which are, I come from obviously the edge world where we tend to think in small because we don't like big, because big takes over the control from us. So I'm really interested in knowing how you're going to talk about this. So I was very interested by this talk. And I'm sure a lot of the people on this call are also going to be very interested by this. And Geoff, I don't think needs an introduction. He's been so much involved with our lives in so many years and in so many ways. And I will not talk more, and I will let Geoff take over.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's very kind of you. And it's good to be here. And it's good to actually take some time in a keynote to explore, I suppose, what we'd call the bigger themes. What are we doing in information-centric networking, and why? Why are we here? And in some ways, I suppose, the answer's obvious, but equally the answer's not obvious. What do we want out of the internet, and what's wrong with what we've got? Well, we want it bigger. We're not talking humans anymore. We're talking devices. We're talking, at the moment, silicon-based devices. We produce out of the factories, and interestingly, there aren't that many these days. There are only 3 big factories left: Taiwan, Samsung, and Intel struggling. We produce around 8 to 10 billion processor chips a year. And fascinatingly, we seem to want to put them all on the internet. And that's a problem. That's a problem in so many ways. And next year, we're probably going to produce more. And that's a question, or sorry, that's an answer or an observation that'll keep on going from year to year. More. So the internet needs to be bigger. But there's an attribute of the internet which was so different from the networks in the past. But even that's under stress. Because what we want to make things enormously big is to get rid of all forms of centralized control. We want our systems to self-learn. And the internet as we know it, with names and addresses, oddly enough, is decentralized in almost everything except names and addresses. What? But yes, we have an organized naming system and an organized addressing system, and it's actually centrally controlled because these things need to be unique, these tokens, in order to make the rest of the network work. But is that statement true? Do they need to be unique to make the rest of the network work? And I think underneath everything we're doing here in this topic, but underneath a lot of our work, we're exploring these topics of resilience and availability, and at the same time, moving away, in theory, from decentralization. How good are we at doing this? We're getting worse. This is terrible. There were 2, these folk were small years and years ago. And in some ways, if you count the number of employees in both Fastly and Akamai, you don't get a large pool of people. It isn't the 500,000 people employed by AT&T or similar numbers employed by US Steel at its peak. These are small companies. But when they had their outages a few months ago, certainly Fastly in Australia, and it might have well been where you live as well, banks went down. Airline booking systems went down, but no one cared. A whole bunch of other services went down. Same with Akamai, and it had a couple of outages, one regional, one more global. But are we resilient? Well, obviously not. If I go back a tiny bit further in time and look at, I think it was October 2017, it was that or 18, a DDoS attack done by baby webcam monitors. Yeah, who knows? On a company since disappeared called Dyn, meant the entire eastern seaboard of the US was offline for a few hours. because obviously if you take out the DNS, because Dyn was a DNS hoster, everything stops. And so we're vulnerable. Are we decentralized in terms of our technology? Well, Google. Their work with Speedy came up with Quick. It came up with BBR as a flow control protocol. They've been working really hard in HTTP3 and trying with TLS 1.3. Now, it's not just Google. But you look at the dominance of this company in actually pushing our technology envelope in the more conventional technologies, then you kind of realize if it wasn't Google, would it happen? And gee, that's a good question. It's a good question because the answer might well be no. And that's deeply disturbing. Google is an advertising platform. It's an advertising platform that sells ads, and that's 95% of its revenue. The fact that it has Android, which operates on more than 80% of the world's mobile device platforms, is almost an accident. It's not deliberate, and oddly enough, it's not their money machine. They casually destroyed Nokia to get into this position. And Nokia, it was kind of, oh, well, goodbye. Nice to know you. And even Apple. Apple isn't a mobile phone manufacturer. It's a shop. It's a shop with a 30% margin and a monopoly position. iOS is a means to an end, not an end. And again, I look at the browser space. 80% of all browsers are Chrome. Google again. Completely dominates it. Why is Google doing this? Well, ultimately, if you peel it all apart, it's to sell more ads. Everything else is leverage. And by the way, I said there were 3 chip manufacturers out there, Samsung, Intel, and TSMC. There's only one. The other 2 aren't making them small enough, oddly enough, small enough, and enough of them. And TSMC now finds itself as being the one chip manufacturer located in Taiwan, of all places. All of these are critical vulnerabilities. This isn't decentralization. This isn't decentralized sort of ecosystems. This is massive centralized orchestration. So why are we here? If we were building something completely different, how have we ended up in this space? This tiny, cramped space that's actually dominated by a small number of players. Was it a technical choice? Did we really get the technology of the internet with this sort of naming and addressing infrastructure wrong? Or perhaps a little bit more comforting, rather than to blame people like me for going, oh, well, you just didn't get it right. Maybe it was always going to happen. Maybe when you throw the old guard out, as in all revolutions, what comes back is Napoleon. What comes back is actually something that's possibly even worse than what we had before. That once you destroy the old king, you tend to get a new one. And maybe that's kind of part of the question, because if we understand the economic history of this kind of centralization and aggregation, maybe we end up in a better position. Because at the moment, where we are should be to you, and it certainly is to me, deeply disturbing. A lot of you are students. Who's going to employ you? Well, the default answer in so many institutions is Google. And if it isn't Google, it's Microsoft. And if it's Microsoft, it's Amazon. And if it isn't Amazon, it's Facebook. And after that, it's kind of, that's a problem. Because we're so dependent on this small set of folk. And these are not nice people. They're private companies. And if they're in a monopoly position, they will exploit it. AT&T started out with the noble goal in 1918 of servicing America's communications need. It was going to be an enlightened monopoly. It was going to give everybody, rural, remote, and metropolitan, a telephone service that was cheap, universally available, and worked in the public interest. How long did that last? 5 years. And by the 1970s, the entire population of the United States was so annoyed with AT&T that the efforts to deregulate it and break it apart in 1982 met with universal acclamation. And it was only the efforts of the PR department of AT&T, which was an entire building in Washington, to try and suppress that bitter resentment at being price gouged for years. So how bad is it today? What do we feel about this dominance? And is it too late to fix it? Have we gone down a path that is not only deeply disturbing, but irrevocable? That the future tomorrow is sort of bound up in where this is. Now, you might go, God, that's terrible. You know, this isn't since the French Revolution. I'm like, what are we doing to ourselves? The answer is, we're just doing what we did before. If you ever go to the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, memories about traveling. Yeah, right. There's actually a really good exhibition on it the last time I went there on American art in the Gilded Age. And it's an age that almost every student in the US understands from history, but the rest of us who didn't get that, we had to read about it. Because he wrote this book in 1873, and it was after the Civil War, it was after the build-up of industrialization, about this sort of new age in America. And it wasn't the golden age. It wasn't a rich age. It was gilded. It was a thin veneer of gold. And in this area and time of rapid industrialization, because it was industrialization versus agrarianism that was actually the true Civil War. It was a change in society so fundamental that we decided to hurl hot lead at each other in industrial volumes. Get worried. But he wrote the Gilded Age as a metaphor of simply the surface and appearance of wealth, of elevated social living, but in actual fact, it only applied to a few. It was a few affluent folk who were unbelievably rich. Sound familiar? It should do. So let's go back and actually look at that foundation of what happened then and see where it sort of resonates with where we are now. Previous agrarian workforce, Civil War was basically industrialization versus agrarianism. It's simple as that. But also what happened in the US was other folks saw this massive unexploited raw resource area, whether it was mines, whether it was farms, whether it was forests, and a huge amount of capital came in from Europe. And so these liberalized capital markets, because after a war, everything's, in pieces. Offshore investment, entrepreneurs flourished. But they weren't entrepreneurs in your town, in your city. Because of the telegraph, and in 1876, the telephone, all of a sudden you could project power and influence way beyond where the horse and carriage could get you. You could project power and influence in real time across the entire communications network. And with a railway system, coincidentally, industrialization, all of a sudden you could move goods. And because these poor people, a lot of them lived in the frozen north, my sympathy, you needed something that worked all year round reliably, unlike horses in the snow. So all of a sudden, you had the projection of power and the fulfillment of that with goods and services through the railways. You had the recipe for massive dislocation. And so we did. We rebuilt that country's economy in the 1870s to 1890s. And out of it did not emerge richness for all. No. It emerged of obscene richness for a small number of folk. Now, these folk are now stout people who name universities, whose names are revered, perhaps except for Theodore Vail, who I think ratted on everyone and repented in the later part of his life. I didn't mean it, I'm sorry. But Westinghouse, that's a company that's still alive. Thomas Edison and General Electric, well, that's still around. US Steel, yes, that's here. Standard Oil, I think we call it SO these days after the breakup, but it's still around. And of course, JP Morgan, who bankrolled the rest of them, still around. How did they do it? They weren't nice people. This was greed. This was corruption. This was astonishing labor exploitation. This was not nice. The way they did it was that they were just moving faster than everyone else. They were moving well beyond the regulatory measures of the day because no one else had projected power across every state, across an entire nation until then. And they literally just threw money at the regulators any way they wanted. And this cartoon from Puck at the time, called The Bosses of the Senate, with the Steel Beam Trust, the Copper Trust, the This Trust, the Standard Oil Trust, is not just amusing, it's disturbingly accurate. What they created in these trust monopolies took the US decades to dismember, and they didn't really succeed. These folk are still around. So they did, I suppose, create a legacy that was extremely difficult for the US to deal with for a long time. With the bipartisan support, both sides of politics, the Sherman Anti-Trust Act came up, and it was an attempt to try and rein this in. Because, like many forms of legislation, it was along the lines of going, people are the victims here. Because when you eliminate competition, you eliminate all forms of sort of market sustainability. And all of a sudden, what you get is an unrestrained monopoly and a restraint in trade. And that was the lever that if you were a national monopoly, the feds got you, not the states. And with gay abandon, it was applied in numerous times. Standard Oil, American Tobacco, and General Electric all fell in 1911 to the Sherman Anti-Trust Acts. And it was applied in 1982 to the then nationally despised, and I would even go so far as to say internationally despised, but no, it was actually internationally liked for different reasons. But AT&T, both liked and loved at the same time. But it's an interesting question. Where did that 70 years go between 1911 and 1982? What happened then? And what happened after 1982? You know, why did the US fail to bring antitrust to its Microsoft? Good question. But maybe we can understand the fact that the Sherman Act was trying to do too much too quickly. Because once these large-scale giants had moved in, they employed a lot of people. Despite their exploitative position, by breaking them up, you actually caused what was then called an economic panic. These days, in the modern parlance of the word, I think we now call economic panics economic corrections because it sounds so much better. But yes, breaking things up causes disaster, short term, but it causes havoc. And the dear old senators and congressmen, I think they're all men at the time too, decided that, whoa, maybe we were too keen. But at the same time, these large companies who'd been busy buying the legislature realised that somehow they'd slipped up and they hadn't managed to buy enough of the federal legislature. So they turned to the federal legislature and said, okay, you need money. I understand. How much does it take? Political lobbying. And that's been a feature for years now, particularly in the US environment. But also, as well as that, they turned with this projection of power from national to international. The auto industry took off. They were making 485,000 units, cars, out of a world production of 606,000 cars in that year. And by 1929, Ford had so managed, and GM and Chrysler, this whole thing about the industrial process and the line, that new modern time and motion assembly matter, the orchestration of workforce and materials, that these cars were cheap. Rolls-Royce's price went up. Ford price for T models sunk by more than 60% in a few years because of the assembly line. And in 1929, they had 80% of the global market share. Why would we antitrust Ford? This was what was making the US rich in the 20s. The US domestic economy was a major beneficiary. Sound familiar? You never kill the golden goose unless you really want to push your country back into misery and penury. So they were politically untouchable. Sound familiar? Now, this wasn't universally acclaimed. And there are a few folk, and Louis Brandeis is the best example I could find, of the folk who said, it actually isn't a behavioural thing. You guys, you large monopolies, have simply grown too big. You're bigger than us, the judicial and state apparatus. You're threatening our democracy. It's not only in the quality of the products you produce, and Ford is a good example. Over the years, it just got worse. And the price of their products, which initially was dirt cheap, once they've got market dominance, it certainly went the other way. It's worse than that. You shape the public space. You shape the regulatory environment. You actually exploit where there's a lack of regulation. You take more risk than you can manage. You become too big to fail, he said 60 years before the big crash of 2018. He was right in every way. But his conclusions were interesting. We can't regulate our way out of this. This power is so entrenched, it's so disproportionate, that quite frankly, we find this so difficult to deal with, we shouldn't let it happen in the first place. Where we are, we can't get out of by mere regulation. And I think the statement that I would apply today to the internet is, can we get out of this by mere technology? Can we push harder at decentralized technologies that offer more power to more people and curtail the power of central orchestration to get us out of this mess? Good question. Now, most politicians would disagree with Louis, and they did at the time, and they still did, that they proudly believe that the reasons why they're in a legislature is it matters. And quite frankly, it's certainly true that you can't build Google without that monopoly. There are legitimate economies of scale, both in physical goods and in the virtual space, where this massive size gives you higher efficiencies and lower prices, and it's by sheer volume that you get the costs down. Try making one of these. Just one. And cast your mind back, not to yesterday, where this thing comes off the line for a cost of about $50, but try making it in 2001. The battery technology, the glass technology, the physical technology, the chips, the awesome software, the supercomputer science processing capability. How much would it cost to make one of these? And the answer is, a massive amount, and it did. But if you defray that cost across, a billion such devices a year, of course they're cheap. Large enterprises gives you access into massive volume. The auto industry, the electricity industry, these were luxury goods, and they only turned into consumer goods because of these awesomely big monopolies, that they turned this luxury good into a commodity utility. Now, Theodore Roosevelt appreciated that and said, look, the only answer is regulation. We need these folk. We just like them well behaved, thank you very much. Get back in your box. This has never been a popular line of argument, and many folk over the years since have argued, look, you just can't expect the private sector to look after the public interest. It's not in their gene pool. They work in the interests of their shareholders. They're out to make money. Nothing else matters. And as Brandeis said, no method of regulation has ever been devised to remove that power of monopolies. And so if you regulate, are you attempting to forestall the inevitable power of monopolies? Or are you trying to simply go, whoa, stop that. You've gone too far. Let me rein you back. Now, that's a fine argument when things are just skating along. But what happens when periods of rapid change? The largest employers, the largest sector of almost every economy in the 1970s was their telephone company. Even in Australia, and at the time, 20 million people, 100,000 people worked for Telstra directly. Another few 100,000 people worked for companies supplying Telstra. How many worked for BT in the UK? 500,000. How many for AT&T? Similar number. How big were those companies? The biggest. The biggest. So when you destroy that, as we did, you get massive change. Everyone walks into the gap. How do you regulate that? How do you prevent regulation from doing this? So let's look at telephony, because I happen to know a lot about it in some ways. I've always found this fascinating. This was the first version, by the way, of multiplexing, that rather than being able to share lots of voice calls in the wire guide, they just shared the pole. Everyone had their own wire. 1876 World Expo, massive boom, just like the internet. And it was Theodore Vail that actually made, I think, a gigantic leap, because in 1880, there wasn't one telephone company. There were tens, there were hundreds. It was the boom, a bit like the boom of ISPs just before the dot-com crash. Everyone had their own local ISP, everyone had their own telephone company. Perth, the most isolated city in the world, poor buggers, had 6 telephone companies. 6 in Perth. 100,000 people if you're lucky. Yeah, this was insane. Theodore Vail went to Congress and said, look, it's easy. Let's get rid of them all. Let's have one company, one service. Let's make a national asset from this technology. Congress bought it. Congress bought it. An enlightened monopoly. So good. Every other country didn't quite buy it. They didn't trust these entrepreneurs. They folded it into their postal service. But the US, no, it was different. Within 5 years, they ratted on everyone. And it took another 60 years to get rid of what they'd just created. But interestingly, they were big. They were US foreign policy and telecommunications. AT&T's interests were America's interests. AT&T was consulted every time state took a position. Why did the US had such a mixed opinion of the rise of the internet? Because AT&T had a very mixed opinion itself. It was paying a huge amount of money in international call accounting settlements from the telephone industry. It didn't like that hemorrhaging of raw cash. So the internet seemed like a way out. At the same time, the internet was a dramatic stake to the heart. The threat was existential. So they weren't quite sure if they were in love with the prospect of getting $4 billion a year back from call accounting settlement, and the threat of destruction. Fear and greed. Interestingly, as ever, greed wins. They went into the internet, they embraced it. They got bought by SBC, as I recall. Oops. So yes, there was pressure in the 1980s to deregulate. A strange artifact of the way deregulation worked in the US, where the baby bells couldn't actually buy each other. So these rapacious proto-monopolies weren't allowed to re-establish a monopoly in the US. So they went elsewhere and said, you need to make yourself open for us to buy you. And it worked. The IMF and the World Bank saw these interests as opportunities to disrupt cozy monopolies. And the disease of deregulation spread around the world. But it wasn't deregulation of telephony. It was deregulation of data. And out of this mess came the internet. And it was touted, particularly by Clinton, as the poster child for getting rid of governments and regulation, getting rid of a highly constrained telephone industry, getting rid of orchestration, getting rid of points of control networking, and replacing it with almost an anarchy. It's private sector investment. There's no orchestration anymore. Everything is market driven. And this was seen as the poster child. Look, the internet works. You telco folk, you're too big. You can't move quickly. All of a sudden, entrepreneurs found venture capital money. There was a lot in the 80s and 90s. And so in the 90s, it just went wild. They moved in and basically took over. But they took over in a highly anarchic manner. But like these devices, it's expensive when you only make one. It's cheap when you make billions. Volume economics come into play. And the bigger players ended up buying the smaller players again and again and again. How big can you get? Wow. I don't have 500,000 people in my workforce. Now, Google is getting close. I mean, it's up to 100,000. It's growing. But it's not a limitation to growth. Facebook has a similar number, and they have how many billion users? There's no geographic limitations anymore. And to be perfectly blunt, there's no regulatory inhibition. And oddly enough, this becomes irrational because there's no business model to follow. So investors were basically willing to tip money into everything really quickly. And even the most bizarre businesses that created a better app for taxis, Uber, became the taxi and just took it over. Renting office space became WeWork with an app. And all of a sudden, WeWork was a giant. Cisco, I'm like, who would have thought? Switches? Who would have thought? A giant at the time. And some of them are still with us. They managed, like Microsoft, like IBM in earlier days, to reinvent itself so many times. And every time, oddly enough, it sort of went just quick enough to avoid destruction and agile enough to pick another winner. And Microsoft's current offer of subscription services and cloud is working. What is Amazon? It's a good question. I'm like, it's some kind of retailer of something. And now it's building bricks and mortar storefronts. I don't get it. But, you know, Amazon does, and they're rich. They're the new Walmart. So what's going on? Well, it's winner take all. But these folk don't compete with each other. They don't compete with anyone. Inside each of their environment is either a monopoly or a cartel, and more than likely, it's a monopoly. Their selective mergers and acquisitions create the new Gilded Age. Well, all of a sudden, there is no regulation. Never has been. They're moving too quickly. Market dominance? Of course there is. Just that small clique. It's exactly the same picture. And the fact that they pay even a derisory amount of taxation is enough to keep the legislators going, yes, they may be horrible people, but they're our horrible people. And they pay taxes in our system. Good on it. Keep it going. And they lobby. Oh my God, they lobby. The annual lobbying on the internet, this is from Open Secrets. We're getting up to $90 million even during lockdown in 2020. The rise continues. Why is 2021 so small? Well, we haven't finished yet. And the data's only in the first few months. And who's doing it? Well, who do you reckon? TikTok is ByteDance, as I recall. All of these folk, you know, you use their apps. Why are they lobbying? Well, because once you get to the top, wherever you look is down. And this is a big top. The current market valuation, you can read as well as I can. Only Tesla and Berkshire Hathaway isn't in this industry. And interestingly, the survivor of the chip foundry business, Taiwan's TSMC, once folk realized that Intel was dead and Samsung wasn't keeping up, tipped all their money into TSMC. And TSMC is saying, sure, we can build it smaller. We can build more of them. Just give us money. Yeah, sure, money, no problem. And so this is where we are today. No finances, no banks, no chemicals, no Johnson & Johnson, no US Steel, no conventional retailer. Amazon's there, but where's Walmart or any of the others? They're not there. And if you compare this to other pools of money, other aggregation of value, at $2.2 trillion in one quarter, Apple's value accumulated by an astounding 10%. And when you talk about 10% of 2 trillion, you're talking $200 billion in just one quarter of the year. This is insane. This is bad. These folk have enough market influence that they run their places. They amass vast fortunes and there's no accountability. There's no public good. There's no decentralization. So, you know, what's the problem? Is it because they're just big? Is this the Brandeis argument all over again? Are they exploitive? For a long time, everyone wanted to work for Google. I'm like, if this is exploitation, everyone said, look, sign me up. I want lunches and dinners at the workplace too. You know, I want to be a Googler. All right, it just looks so cool. Are they distorting markets? I'm like, is that the problem? Are they extracting monopoly rentals from consumers? Interesting point. I don't pay for search. I don't pay for Google Docs. I don't pay for Gmail. Where's the monopoly rental extraction? Because I can't see it. And in fact, are they giving me what I don't want? Well, no, because quite frankly, they're focused on giving me what I want. Now, you could say, the evil is giving you what you want before you even knew you wanted it. You're probably right. But nevertheless, what they've done is harness this massive ability of technology, and oddly enough, this massive decentralized capability to grow as big as they want without requiring the cooperation of anyone else. In permissionless innovation, you have permission to grow as big as you dream, and they did. And so all of a sudden, what they're focused on is me. Now, I am an advertising market of one. And if I went to, who was it, the traditional advertising broker for the television industry? Solomon Brothers, I think, in New York, and said, hi, sell ads to me. I wouldn't even get in the front door. I can't capitalize my profile. But if 1 billion of me walk up to Solomon Brothers and say, hi, we're a market, the red carpet will be rolled out. And so what they've able to do is take 4 billion of us and create an advertising market of that 4 billion and segment it to one and sell each profile to each advertiser. I can't sell it. They have ruthlessly sold it because individually what we had was worthless. Taken together, what we had was a gold seed. And oddly enough, that's what's being sold, me. But there are side effects, there always are. There's always a downside. This great decentralized world, there are downsides. Because quite frankly, we have now built a surveillance infrastructure that makes almost every nation state player envious like crazy. The Snowden revelations of a few years ago, why were they a surprise? If Google had did this, and I'm not saying whether they are or they aren't, I'm not sure it would even have raised an eyebrow. The fact that it was the US doing it, a state actor, was incredibly disturbing. So I think, excuse me, the state actors are sort of going, but we thought you were okay with this, oh citizens. We thought if you let Google and Facebook and Amazon do this, you would let us do it too. And the answer was no. For some reason, these unaccountable private institutions, it's quite okay. But you're in the public space. You're not allowed to do this. What? That makes no sense. But interestingly, this is where we are. We're in an age where it's not the industrial age. And it's hard to say whether it's the information age or the surveillance age. Now, initially, there was a very cavalier attitude to data security and a cavalier attitude to privacy. I would actually say all that's over. Google or Facebook, let's say, cared deeply about my profile. They care very deeply. Why? Because they don't want Apple to know, and they don't want Google to know. They don't want their peers and cohorts to look over their shoulder and find all this data about me that they've worked so hard to amass. So oddly enough, this idea that, big tech doesn't care. Oh, they care a lot. They care a huge amount. They just care in different ways than you think. And so the regulations, even the GDPR, is the wrong direction. Because I think we've moved away from a human-dominated society into a computer-mediated one. And a lot of what you've been talking about is automated systems that not only track what we do, but take one step further and facilitate what we are about to do. And it is this computer mediation that is the major theme here. The network, the internet, there's nothing about that anymore. Packets are commodity. It doesn't matter. What's actually going on is this revolution from the industrial and physical age into something that is triggered with this abundance. Computing power is not a problem. We used to pay $10 million for the amount of compute power, possibly more, inside this device. And it wasn't that long ago. It was the last of the mainframes in the late 1980s. So computing is abundant, Storage is abundant. We're now building terabit cables. We're now building hundreds of terabit cables. Comms is abundant. But all that abundance has a very small group of cartels and monopolists. That's what's in the middle. And as Andrew Jackson said, and for the folk in the US, is he still on your note? They changed it to some kind of plastic thing, I think, and I'm not even sure if he's still there, but he was certainly there. And one of the things he said in, 1830, is every time you let a monopoly flourish, it's at the expense of the public interest. But, how rich can you get? If you haven't watched Chinatown, and it's old, 1974, you should. It was actually Roman Polanski's attempt at one of these gangster thrillers, and it's a nice movie. Faye Dunaway was in it. But this particular piece of dialogue, I think, gets to the heart of what we're talking about. Gitty says to Cross, how much are you worth? It could be Zuckerberg. And he says, I've no idea. How much do you want? He says, I just want to know what you're worth. Over 10 million. Oh, my God. Yes, of course. Why are you doing it? How much better can you eat? What can you buy that you can't already buy? The future. JP Morgan is there 130 years later. US Steel is there. General Electric is there. They bought a future. So is Google. So is Facebook. So is that. They'll still be there in a century. Will they be as big? Interesting conversation. But they'll still be there. So we're not sure that the Sherman Act is good enough. So this day, right now in Congress, bipartisan support, which in the days of post-Trump is a relative rarity. But, there are 5 anti-big tech bills going forward. This time for sure. This time we're going to regulate our way out of this. Ending platform monopoly. Sounds good, doesn't it? Possibly because that's all that's good about it. It's not going to be effectual. The good old EU, the Digital Services Act. This is what the French are doing, content moderation. You can't let anyone post anything. Hate speech and insanity prevails. This destroys our society. We've got to do something about it so that it's, and they're right. But is regulation the answer? Interesting. The Chinese have taken a different view. They always have. Hello, we don't like what you're doing. Rip yourself apart. Okay, says Jack Ma. I can see the writing on the wall. What about Didi, the competitor to Uber that Uber was forced to line up with? I'm sorry, your app doesn't work anymore. What do you mean? It doesn't. You can't even sell it anymore. Take it down. Direct action. I want to float on the New York Stock Exchange. Why? There's not enough money in China. No, sorry. We're really, really worried that you're going to start exporting data into places where we have no control. Stop it. Which is kind of an interesting way of trying to, curtail a lot of this kind of emerging behavior modes. But are they stopping those folk? Or are they, if you will, casting themselves into a second wave of digital poverty? Because we need these people. That's the problem. We need their size and we need their leverage in order to dream as big as we're dreaming. Because in some ways, working on the monopolists isn't the problem. It's us as users that is really the issue here. So these public sector efforts, it's not going to be this time for sure. There's more coming because it's not really going to grapple with it. Why? Because at the heart of this is something that's even more deeply disturbing than all of that. And that's the bit I actually want you to think about as you work through information-centric networking, as you expose the fundamentals of what we're trying to do in this communications infrastructure. The network itself is incidental. The social changes are fundamental. Because what do we choose to view? What do we choose to believe? And you've seen in the US recently, that's not only an abstract question, it's a question in reality. Because it's important to us as a society to stop being misled by, dare I say it, fake news. But it's not Trumpian fake news. It is truly fake. It is truly active deception. Who arbitrates what's good and what's bad? What do we choose to look at? Search is everything. Search is the modern library. Search is the space of what we know and what we choose to understand and view. Search is everything. And search is Google. what we think, the language we use. 2021, Google had 89% of the market. Bing was 5%. Why do people use Bing? Because Bing's answers look like Google's answers. If they didn't, we'd think Bing was lying. It's that bad. Because this is truly a battle about what we think. And that isn't the subject of any congressional regulation. Now, this is an amazing place. On my phone, no matter where I am, locked down at home at the moment, I can ask any question and Google will plow through the world's information and give me an answer in milliseconds. Oh my God, what a dream come true. And I didn't even pay for it. I didn't have a room full of folk reading through all these encyclopedias, manuscripts, and papers. I just asked Google. Oh my God, that's empowering. We have produced almost unconsciously out of this anarchic, decentralized world, one of the towering achievements of humanity. Fantastic. At the same time, its real purpose is incredibly threatening, because the whole reason why Google exists is to sell my profile to advertisers, to preemptively not just guess my future needs, but like every supermarket on the planet, to influence my future needs and ultimately to dictate my future needs. And if that's not threatening, you're not a human. Because this isn't about the internet. No. That's already died and gone to silicon heaven. This is about something far deeper. This is about us as a society. Now, you might go, oh my God, it's all going to go terrible. Well, it might. These things, these temporal things come and go. And where we are now is indeed a passing phase. And as in 1776, Edward Gibbon did a mighty piece of work, 6 volumes. It was the age of pen and paper. And there were no typewriters. He wrote this all out. He did this massive work tracing the Roman Empire and Western civilization from its height to its decline in 1468, in the fall of Constantinople to the Turks. And the thesis he made, which may be comforting to all of us, who knows, that the seeds of its decline, its ignominious sacking, its continual wave of sackings as it declined and fell, were actually sown in the way it rose. And in some ways, all of these giants of today will go. These monopolies will pass, because the eventual competitors will not compete at their own game. They will go around them. And ultimately, that's, I think, all we can hope, that this will happen soonish rather than, a century or two in the future. But it will happen, and that's good. Hopefully that's given you a bit of pause to think and a bit of pause to give you some context as to why information-centric networking falls into this space of trying to understand not just bigger, but decentralized, and how to create structures that support alternative views of manipulating and working in our world that don't just reinforce the terrible situation of the small gilded few, and actually empower the rest of us in more realistic ways than merely just a vehicle for more advertising. Thank you very much. And with that, if you have any questions, I will be pleased to try and grapple with them or share with you my uncertainty about, how little I really know in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. We do have a question from Dave Oren, who is asking, given how update your analysis is, do you see any downsides?
Downsides to the current situation? Every time there was, by the way, hi Dave, we're both meant to be in Paris.
Right. Given how, depressing the whole thing was, I was asking about upsides.
Oh, upsides. The upside is that there's no longer a large and torrid debate over Did that really happen or didn't that not? Because the work of the key press, I can resolve any argument whatsoever with what I think of the facts or what Wikipedia call it. This is incredibly empowering. We would not, and we could not, have developed a vaccine for the COVID-19 virus in a small matter, literally, of weeks, a scale of weeks, without the internet. We could never have done that. The Black Plague, the Black Death, the plague, killed 25% of the folk in Florence in 1500. The collateral damage of that battleground in my cellular infrastructure, we have a much better understanding. As humans, our life form, we have a much greater expectation that the future is understandable and predictable, and I'm going to be alive to see it, as distinct from the Hobbesian life is nasty, brutish, and short. The upside is that we've actually elevated the human condition, and we actually have been able to achieve amazing things by harnessing our collective power. If we're ever going to survive as a civilization through the inevitable changes in climate, forestalling it is not an action. We're going to have to apply exactly the same tools, as collective tools, as we've applied with finding a vaccine for the COVID-19 virus. And I think we will. I am optimistic, despite the last hour. But, you know, I'm optimistic in ways that say this can work for us, but we need to, you know, not be distracted by the monopolists who are simply trying to extract from our wallet. We need to move beyond that and understand that the scale of problems that we have demands tools like the internet and demands that we actually come to grips with it and use it better and sort of put up with the monopolies as a sort of a necessary evil for a short period of time and hope that, you know, the next generation or two will give us better answers on how to deal with it, and they will. This is not permanence. This is just transitory. Does that sound better? Do you feel better now?
Sort of. I mean, by the way, the 25% in Florence, they actually did very, very well because they locked down. And in Verona, it was 60%. So Florence is a lot better than most of the other Italian cities.
Oh my God. You know, here where I live, and I live in Canberra in Australia, which is a relatively small town, 350,000 people. The current concern about COVID is, well, we really don't want one death. And I suppose that's an elevation of our capability as a society, that rather than 60% being, oh, geez, that's a bit of a bummer, one death is too much. Isn't that good? I think it's good. I think we've sort of sharpened what we regard as being a deliverable from technology. And that's great. You know, that's the upside of this. Does it balance the scale? I don't think anyone wants that degree of attrition from viri. No one wants that. But is where we are good? No, not necessarily. It's still not good. But I'm not going to throw it all away because the downside's terrible.
Another question from Eduardo. Demands, isn't centralization a natural process in a society, or is it possible to avoid it with proper regulation?
You know, that is such a great topic. And any student of history who's looked at the Russian Revolution and the thinking before that with Marxist economics, the needs of production, etc., and Bakunin and his anarchists sort of looked at this in exactly the same principles of social terms. That can anarchies, can decentralization flourish as human society? Do we need these kings, these Googles as a necessary precondition to orchestrate ourselves? Or are we thinking people? Can we survive without them? You know, I think we're testing that. And in the same way that the printing press tested the power of the church in European society, in the same way that industrialization basically pulled apart the power of kings and actually introduced new social powers, what we are building today is ripping that apart. But the real question is, are we just bringing up another king, another point of centralization, and betting it not in the technology, but deep in where the corporate entities of Google and Amazon sit in their boardrooms? Or are we able to move past this? Do we have competition and volume of scale, so economics of scale of volume at the same time? That's a great question. I have no idea what the answer is. And I have no idea whether orchestration is necessary or not in the final analysis. But, you know, we've done an amazing thing in some small areas. There are no routing police in the internet. There's no routing God. There's no one to tell you where packets go. The routing system has its own, I was going to use the word intelligence, but that would be a lie. It has its own ability to orchestrate the internet's topology, and no one's in charge. As a system, it's phenomenally decentralized, and the fact that you are hearing my voice means it's working for you and it's working for me, for all values of you and for me. So yeah, you know, these things exist in certain small places and have flourished. So we shouldn't give up on the effort. But, you know, the larger picture, we tend to collapse into folk who centralize and orchestrate. And maybe that's where we should have resisted, but I'm not sure how. Sorry. Great question.
Yeah, we have another question from Eve Schooler at Intel. Is a whole earth crisis the only way for us to refocus the internet and its technology towards public good?
No, unfortunately, Eve. I have to disagree. The problem with crisis, in fact, let me go sideways for a second. I'm in the 8th week of lockdown, and there's another 4 to go here in Canberra, having so much fun. And in the first week, everyone said, oh my God, this is serious. This is a crisis. We have to stay off the streets. And everyone did. In week 2, a few ventured out. It's still a crisis, but we don't care. We're now in week 6, week 7, week 8. It just goes on and on and on. Will this ever stop? I doubt it. But it's not a crisis anymore in our heads. In our heads, we're over it. And the problem with pulling the crisis bell is that if you're looking at something that's going to take more than the 5-year plan, more than that, and a degree of orchestration and effort to respond to this situation, saying it's a crisis almost brings on the expectation that we're able to produce an instant answer. It causes the regulators to go, this time for sure, with these 6 acts, we'll solve this problem. And they won't, and it won't. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of assessing our technology. It's a way of understanding in the incubators of our research labs and universities, what ideas should we concentrate on and allow to give primacy? How should we develop themes that, if you will, empower more and disempower central organisation, and hope, because that's all we can do, that this induces a way of thinking that allows us to challenge the points of orchestration and aggregation of power. We've tried that in universities for centuries, by the way, and sometimes it's worked well, sometimes it's been an abject failure. But as I said, I don't see this as a crisis necessarily. What I do see is we have to call it for what it is. And I think we have to understand the incredible change that you and I as humans are living through. This is the Industrial Revolution again. This is social dislocation again. This is everything that doesn't mean life is predictable and stable. It's not. But at the same time, it's exciting and it's a set of challenges. And responding to that in that way, allowing ideas to flourish, is I think the best as a human response we can do. Crisis, well, it kind of says, we've got to fix this. And the answer is, well, yes, we do, but we don't understand what a fix is. So there's a certain amount of searching around the problem before we leap into making changes. That's the best I can do, Eve. I mean, maybe it's just the way I think about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another question. There's a ton of questions popping up. Dirk asked the question a bit similarly to Eduardo's question before. Is this just the tendency of the profit rate to fall and economic concentration all over again? So we're going back into like decentralization versus decentralization, will it make a difference towards, this is a conference about ICN, right? So will it make a difference whether the infrastructure is based on ICN or on something different? And I would add my own thing there is that there's more and more data-driven systems. So obviously ICN makes a lot of sense. So what is your point on that?
What you're doing is incredibly valuable. And what this line of thought is incredibly, it's a rich seam of the future. You see, we're not very good at being imaginative. The internet was actually modeled on the telephone network. Nothing more, nothing less. It had the same sort of guidance through the wires, transactions almost as conversations. And the telephone network was built on the telegraph, which, was a model of the postal system. And this idea of edge devices pushing transactions through almost a neutral framework of transmission has been a feature of all of these systems. In information-centric networking, you're kind of wondering what a transaction is and where is this information? Is it smeared as an attribute of, I'll call it network, but hopefully you get my idea that it's not smart things at the edge, dumb stuff in the middle that moves attributes from one smart thing to another smart thing, but it becomes a different kind of mesh. And if you think about that model and stop trying to reinvent the internet, routing words instead of numbers, that's not the idea. The idea is that the concepts, the words, the thought, the information is part of the fabric that the edges interact with, not with each other. And that line of thought, as an abstract line of thought, is, I think, one of those fundamental thoughts, as fundamental as packet networking. Every packet doesn't follow a path, it charts its own path through the internet. And that, to my mind, was the essence of what the internet was in just that one sentence. That was the reason why it worked. Why is this going to work? If we can get that down to that sentence, it kind of goes, it's different because I'm not trying to get through the network. I'm trying to negotiate with what else is out there on its own terms. That's an astonishing thought. And if that's what you're building or capable of building, that will make a difference. That will more than make a difference. It will revolutionize what we're doing. Totally. So, if this is a good thought, yay, let's go there and do it. That's my view. So, I don't think it's going to just replace an old king with a new king. Again, I think this has revolutionary properties, and hopefully they'll come to bear, because change is good, particularly where it is now. Can't be any worse.
Well, I guess you made a lot of people smile here. Okay, so I'm going down to questions. Dave Oren again. You didn't mention cryptocurrencies, which is both a good and a bad topic. So do you have a view on how this all fits together with the rest of the picture? I will tell you, I'm in Canada here, and a lot of people are starting to have a big problem with cryptocurrency because of the amount of power that the mining takes. So yeah, what are your thoughts about cryptocurrency in the picture?
Poor old Iceland, hey, all of that free electricity, all of it being used to mine cryptocurrency, to mine Bitcoins. Wasn't meant to be like that. Our concept of creating difficult problems that are ultimately soluble as being the key to this, which is what Bitcoin's all about. Solve a really hard problem. I'm going to need a lot of compute power. Sure. That's the whole reason why you're solving it, not someone else. Creating barriers to entry, which are ultimately incredibly wasteful, is crazy. So it's not the idea of immutable ledgers. It's not the idea of a decentralized ledger, but the whole way in which Bitcoin approached the problem of preventing forgeries, duplications, and abuse by making the problem so hard that it wasn't an easy job to muck it up. made it hard in such a way that it becomes wasteful. Sure, we have abundant computing, but Bitcoin really stresses that assertion out. I think we got it wrong. But at the same time, I'm not sure what the right answer would be. In some ways, you need to make something infeasible without saying, oh, but I'm going to get, a year's production of graphics cards to solve the answer. No, you don't need to do it that way. Is there another way of doing it? I am not a billionaire. And part of the reason is I haven't found another way of doing it, right? But there's got to be a better way of doing this. There simply has to. And it's not the bank, and it's not Bitcoin either. It's something else, I believe. I think Bitcoin is merely a distraction, and a very wasteful one at that.
Yeah, actually, I will jump the next question because actually Alicia, who has also the next question, says my 2 cents on the currency problem is what's needed is digital currency and not Bitcoin. And then Dirk added, this is what some countries are doing in China. So another question from Alicia again. She says, although BGP of the public internet has no central control, the fact that private networks are taking over, an increasing amount of traffic, is that an issue for you?
Let's understand what's going on here. When we talk about private networks, we're talking content distribution networks. We are not talking the old school of enterprise networks with mainframe computers in the basement. They're gone. The entire world is cloud. Anyone who has a computer in their basement is living a 19th century life. That's irrelevant these days. You don't run your own hardware. You let cloud do it. And the way cloud works these days, of course, is there's so much of it that they do not want to be, if you will, vulnerable to any third party. And that idea of saying, I'm not going to buy your transmission services, I'm going to build my own cable. Google have just done the landing in the UK of the next cable that goes Spain, UK, New York, 350 terabits per second, cables going into Indonesia, Singapore, Australia, cables around Africa, all privately owned. So when you talk about private networks, these days, you're actually talking about Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and you're talking about cables and infrastructure top to bottom of being that private facility. But what you're really saying is that the global infrastructure is now accessible to private capital, that we don't need governments to bring up the necessary $1 billion to build an undersea cable. We don't need the gutta percha company to get a license from both the United Kingdom and the United States to do this hideously expensive undertaking to lay a piece of copper across the Atlantic. We don't need no stinking governments no more. Private capital is enough. And we bent all the rules of the seafloor to allow this to happen. So yes, we are building this network with private money, not public sector investment. It's all a case of responding to market need. And yes, it's moving really quickly. Is this good? Well, in the telephone network, when you built an undersea cable, it was meant to last for 25 years, but you didn't want to dump 25 years of capacity on the market next Wednesday because the price would plummet. So you ended up building this massive cable and then rationing it out, 64K voice stream by 64K voice stream, in order to keep its value high. What a strange distortion of a market. It's like building this massive bus, ocean liner, and then selling it, one seat at a time. It's ridiculous. So yes, we're now doing a whole bunch more things in this private market that we never dreamt of doing before. Good? I think it's good. What do they run internally? Who cares? It's kind of their problem. The internet is now just the last mile access. It goes from data center, oh, there's one just over there, into my house. And that's true for the richer parts of the world today, and it's true for everyone tomorrow, because the inevitable rollout of this kind of content-centric networking becomes the global model. And this is not necessarily a model about networking. This is a model about content and information. And when you think about it, why are we running the internet over the last mile access line? Why are we running a globally unique naming and addressing system to span 10 kilometers? Because we use applications to do the rest. My packets in IP aren't getting to you. No. They're getting to the WebEx data center. And after that, and other packets get to you. It happens to contain my voice, but it's no longer end to end. So if you think about that kind of model of content, and I'll call it networking, but I'm not sure it is, of content dissemination and distribution, even my domain name is not a locator anymore. It's a weak facsimile for that piece of content. Why am I using that? Historical legacy. Could I use a different dictionary and lexicon to talk about this content? Well, of course I could. But it's easier and cheaper for Google and Netflix and others to simply borrow from what we've understood and did in the past. It's harder to venture out in a new model. That's your job as researchers, to venture into new models of understanding, well, we don't need no stinking DNS anymore, and we don't. I don't need no global address space anymore, because we don't. What do we need? What will work in this area of massively replicated content, where it's the content we're trying to identify, not its name or its address. It's another way of thinking, and I think it's a very liberating way. Hopefully I've answered you. I don't know. I've just been rattling on.
Well, I guess there's other questions that popped up. I think one is a comment about your cryptocurrency response, which is from Dave Oren. Once you decide the fundamental of whether you're okay, depending on trusted intermediaries, the rest of the design kind of falls out. His view is that permissionless blockchains for cryptocurrency fundamentally fundamentally valuing criminals over the decent public. So this is a comment on what you just said. So I don't know if you want to comment again.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
You know, a lot of this is all about negotiation of trust and the assumption of authority. And what we've learned, and I think bitterly in the United States, is there is no wisdom in crowds worth having. But if you're not relying on the wisdom of crowds because you really shouldn't trust it, then where are your points of trust, your points of surety? And in some ways in society, we've always managed to invent and bestow trust in certain parties. And whether it was the king, the government, or Google, God, we've tried to do that because we're just not sure about the wisdom of crowds, and I think rightly so. So in some ways, we're always going to have to invent these artifacts, these anchors of trust. What we're trying to avoid is the subversion of that trust. We're even happy to pay them as long as they're not subvertible. And indeed, the entire web system, if you think about the PKI that makes that lock on your screen, it's just a thin veneer of plausibility, but it's good enough. Maybe that's where we go. I don't know, but it's a very deep question, and I think one of the more fundamental ones. So yeah, thanks for asking it.
And I guess we're getting out of time, but there's there's another question from Lisha Shang, which is she comes back to your the comment about the Google cable, and I think this is something that everybody is also a little bit concerned about. Is that the problem with the Google cable? It's that it's a stovepipe, and they control everything. They control the physical app, they control the app, and it's not open to others. And I would add to this that, for example, in my world of IoT, we don't call it the cloud anymore. We call it the clouds, because each one of these companies has a stovepipe, has a vertical integration, and it's really hard because it's not open.
This has always been a tension, and it was even there in the telephone network with the first undersea cables. There was a cable built for Australia and New Zealand called ANSCAN, And it was almost the last of the fiber electrical cables, that electrical repeaters on the seafloor. An amazing achievement. Thank God we don't do that anymore. And it served the citizenry of Australia, of New Zealand, and Canada for making telephone calls. Did it serve the United States? Well, only if they paid the Canadians an exorbitant price. Did it serve the folk in Indonesia? No. Did it serve anyone else in Asia? No. Oceania? No. So in this terminology, the telephone companies built stovepipes, and a lot of them. But they made it their business to, if you will, share that stovepipe in carefully rationed quantities to others. They created monopolies. Is that any different to what Google is doing? Well, yes, there's not even the pretense of sharing. It's honest. It's what it is. It's our wire. Was it always thus? I suspect so, Leisha. We never really got this sharing thing under control. And in fact, the only place where we've got this sharing thing kind of there is Wi-Fi. And why is the 5 gigahertz spectrum a nightmare? Why is the 2.4 gig spectrum a nightmare? Because the tiny amount of truly open shareable radio spectrum is so astonishingly small, because everyone else is trying to make bucket loads of money from the rest of it, that it becomes unusable in so many places because it's simply crowded. So is this saying something even deeper about what is sharing versus organized rationing? What is true sharing? Why isn't Wi-Fi everything? It's a really good question, because it could have been, but it isn't. And some of the issues behind that statement about our exploitation of the radio spectrum into not quite stovepipes, but exclusive bands, parallels what you're saying with stovepipes. There is no doubt Google needed this cable. And there is no doubt Google wanted complete control. And there is no doubt Google had the money to do it. Surely, means, motive, and money, isn't that enough? It's pointless getting in the way of it, and it's pointless making them share. At least at this point, it won't happen. So if you want to be at the other end of the cable and all the countries lining up, hey, Google Cable, come here. Yes, it's going to happen, and it's going to keep on going on for the moment. Absolutely. Good or bad, this is where we are. I'm sure the Spanish fought like crazy to get one end of that cable to land up there in northern Spain. Sure of it. In the same way that the Indonesians fought like crazy to get the Echo cable landing in Indonesia, and not where it should have landed, the logical place, Singapore. Because that's Singapore, not Indonesia. Yeah.
Well, Geoff, if I injected just one sentence, I think Google's stovepipe seems to me fundamentally different from iPod, the ATT's stovepipe. Like you explained very clearly, this Google controls the top. So therefore,
this is vertical integration.
That is a fundamental thing. They control the top. They want to control your life. It's way beyond just that cable, whether it's shared.
Oh, I think they've gone to the point where many other folk have gone who build supermarkets. I don't want to influence your decision about what you put in your shopping cart. I want to tell you what you're going to put in your shopping cart. From influence to persuasion to direction. And in some ways, all of these companies in the advertising business, the golden dream, as Hal Varian always puts it, is it's not spam anymore, and it's not even information anymore when it becomes direction. Should you be worried about that? I am. You should be too. Thanks, Lisa. Good point.
Yeah, and because of their possession of the physical resources, not only they want to control your life, it also prevent others from doing that, because you do not have their resources, you have no access. You cannot.
Well, I think Google has kind of their major problem with amassing my profile is Facebook, who's amassing my profile, is Apple, who's amassing my profile. it currently is almost a kind of wary equilibrium between these players that jealously guard their own assets and protect them from each other. And certainly all of them have a common interest in repelling all new assailants to their treasured place. So that's the kind of dynamic we're seeing right now. As I said, my hope is that in changing the paradigm of what we think of networks, we change what we think of resources and control. We change what we think of this computer-based environment that we are interacting with. Excuse me, that it's no longer as susceptible to single points of orchestration, which, despite its original properties, is what those giants have managed to achieve, this overarching orchestration and control of resources, which is deeply disturbing, absolutely.